Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our voting rights training. Rooted in the dreams of immigrants and inspired by the promise of opportunity, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, advocates for an America in which all Americans can benefit equally from and contribute to the American dream. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights for Asian Americans and to build and promote a fair and equitable society for all. Advancing Justice AAJC is a national 501c3 nonprofit founded in 1991 in Washington, D.C. Advancing Justice AAJC is the voice for the Asian American community, the fastest growing population in the U.S., fighting for civil rights through education, litigation, and public policy advocacy. We serve to empower our communities by bringing local and national constituencies together and ensuring Asian Americans are able to participate fully in our democracy. We're really excited to provide this introductory level training today on voting rights with Niyati Shah, our Director of Litigation. This presentation is recorded and you will receive the recording and a copy of the presentation following the webinar. Should you have any questions during the presentation or after the presentation, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. We will be using a poll and the chat box today during the training, and you can find those on your Zoom screen. They might be easier to find if you're tuning in from your laptop or a desktop. And if you're on a phone or a tablet, you will have to scroll over in your Zoom screen to find those items. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Niyati.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be with you today. And before we get started, I just want to flag a couple of big picture points. Our training today is a big picture overview. State laws differ from state to state, so please be sure to check your state-specific rules and regulations as they apply to voting, and know that we have state-specific fact sheets on our website, and many of them will be translated. We're uploading them as we get them, so everything might not be there at this very instant, but they will be there soon. And so keep checking in, and of course, if you have any questions, feel free to contact Bessie or myself. So let's get started. Let's go to the first slide, and we're going to start out right from the bat without any introduction about voter registration. So I'd just like to know, based on your participation, how many people are registered to vote today? So as you can see, most of you are registered to vote today, and that's really good. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that really matters as we go through this presentation and this training. But let's put aside these results for a minute and go to the next slide, where I kind of want to show you why the history of voting in the United States.
Sorry about that. Looks like we had some tech issues, so we're going to start that video over again.
And welcome. Hello, friends, and
everyone hear
welcome
this?
to the Pursuit of History. On this episode, we'll be discussing the history of voting rights. Casting a vote for local, state, and federal officials is an important civic responsibility in America. It's an opportunity to have your voice be heard and to engage with members of your community in a democratic process. For American citizens, the chance to vote begins at 18, but that wasn't always the case. In the early years of America, only a small percentage of people were allowed to vote. Nope, No, keep going. Keep going, almost there. Okay, stop. At the founding of America, only adult, white, landowning men were allowed to vote. Not surprisingly, the people making the decisions in the early days of America were, you guessed it, white male landowners. While they wanted to ensure the power of government came from the people, they struggled with determining exactly who qualified as the people. As James Madison said, allow the right to vote exclusively to property owners, and the rights of persons may be oppressed. Extended equally to all, and the rights of property owners may be overruled by a majority without property. It was quite the early conundrum. They ultimately decided to leave the decision up to individual states. Some states dropped the property requirement over time, but the pool of voters was still limited to adult white men until 1870 with the passing of the 15th Amendment. 5 years after the Civil War ended, the 15th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. With it, African American men gained the right to vote. On March 31, 1870, a man named Thomas Mundy Peterson became the first Black person to cast a vote in a local election in New Jersey. Unfortunately, states still found ways to limit African American men's right to vote through literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation tactics, and grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses stated that African American men could only vote if their grandfather had voted. This limited the vote for many men who had enslaved ancestors. The clauses weren't declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court until 1915. Likewise, poll taxes and literacy tests in the South became voting barriers. In Mississippi, for example, voters were required to pay a special tax for 2 years before being allowed to cast a vote. If you couldn't afford to pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. States also issued literacy tests filled with complicated questions designed to severely limit the African American vote. The 1900s brought a wave of changes. In 1920, a new group of American citizens gained the right to vote: women. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was a great victory for the supporters of women's suffrage. 4 years later, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act finally gave American Indians the right to vote. Remember the poll taxes and literacy tests we talked about a few moments ago? In the 1950s and 60s, civil rights groups began making progress towards breaking down those barriers. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, making poll taxes illegal. That same year, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It forbid discrimination based on religion, race, gender, or national origin. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed. It forbid anyone from denying the right to vote to citizens based on their race. Another historic event happened in 1965. President Johnson made the decision to send military forces into Vietnam. In the years that followed, support for the Vietnam War waned. Simultaneously, a new fight was emerging on the home front: the fight for the right to vote for young Americans. Armed with a call to action from the 1940s, old enough to fight, old enough to vote became their rallying cry. In 1970, the 26th Amendment was passed, extending the right to vote to all U.S. citizens of age 18 and over. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act became a law. It works to protect the right to vote for people with disabilities by requiring polling locations to be accessible to all. In the years that have followed, Americans are still debating issues about voting rights. From the voting rights of convicted felons, to lowering the voting age to 16, and even establishing Election Day as a national holiday, people understand the importance of the right to vote and fight every single day to ensure that this right is safely secured in American democracy. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget,
So as you can see, the right to vote wasn't available for everybody. And even today, voter suppression is alive and well. And it's so important that we do everything in our power to make sure that we have the privilege that is granted to us and exercise it. So the next thing that I want to do is talk about why voting would matter to you. What issues would you be voting on or would seek to influence? And if you can put your answers in the chat box, that would be great at this time. Okay, I see somebody say education, healthcare, LGBTQ issues. Healthcare seems to be a big one. Immigration. Any other issues? Climate change or the environment for sure. Racial justice, gun control, housing, voting rights, very apropos of today, agreed. Okay. Language access, yes, also very important. Okay, great. So I think I want to show, let's go to the next slide. And when we did a polling with API vote and API data, these are the issues that were most important to the Asian American community writ large. And many of the issues that you all cited are listed in here: healthcare, gun control, the environment, racism and racial discrimination. It's particularly relevant in these times of COVID, as we've learned, and education, right? And so earlier when we started and we did who's registered to vote, well, only registered voters can cast a ballot. And only those voters can influence these and all the other issues that we talked about. Otherwise, everybody else will decide for us. So it's super important that we vote, and in order to vote, you have to be a registered voter. And we'll talk about how in this particular election a little bit, being a registered voter matters even more. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. Now let's talk about who is allowed to vote. We saw in the video introduction about how these various requirements have come into play. So in every state, at minimum, you have to be a US citizen and 18 years old on election day. I will say there's one exception for Massachusetts, who say 16-year-olds can do it, but by and large, most states will be 18 years old. And then each state have minimum residency requirements. Some say 20 days, some say longer or shorter. Some have mental capacity rules that you have to be mentally competent or not be declared mentally incompetent in order to vote. And they have felony conviction rules as well. So make sure that you are eligible to register to vote, and then register to vote early, and make sure you're registered to vote at your current address. That is where you live today. All right, let's go to the next slide. There are many ways you can register to vote. Not all states have all of these methods, but let's go through. The easiest one is online. And again, not every state has them, but more and more states are having online voter registration. And even in states that do have online voter registration, you're going to generally need your driver's license or state ID cards. If your state doesn't offer online voter registration, your state will always have a voter registration where you can go on their website and download it and print it, or you could get it from your local election office. You will need to fill it out, sign it, and some states will have additional requirements, documentations that you may need to provide, such as your proof of identity. So make sure you provide all the right documentation and get registered to vote. Some states also allow you to register in person on election day at your polling place. Now that is one of the best things you can do for access to voter registration, and it's something that I would say if your state doesn't have, that might be something that you can influence with your vote, as well as online voter registration. So think about these issues. If it's harder in your state to vote because you don't have online voter registration, or what we call same-day voter registration, or polling place registration, why is that? Why not? Can you make a difference by casting a ballot to make it easier for you to register to vote, to help your communities register to vote? And so those are quite good questions to ask if your state doesn't have these capabilities, and to advocate for them. And one of the best ways you can advocate for these changes is by voting. I will also flag that many states are better. Some states are better than others in providing language online voter registration. So that may be harder to get. So often the paper forms are better, but if it's available in your state, that's a really good resource as well. All right, let's go to the next slide. I want to keep in mind some important dates when you are thinking about casting a ballot. First of all, many states have voter registration deadlines, and they are passing us by very quickly. So make sure that you get registered to vote. Many states will not send you an absentee ballot, even if you request it, if you are not currently registered. And that's why in this particular election, it is so important to ensure that you are registered where you live now. Then there will be deadlines by when you will have to request your vote by mail or absentee ballot. Those are usually later this month for most states, but we recommend that you do it immediately so you have enough time to receive the ballot and then mail the ballot back. Remember that there are deadlines by when your mail ballot has to be postmarked. Usually it's election day, and then different states have very strong requirements by when that vote by mail or absentee ballot has to be received. In some states, it's as soon as November 4th. Some states have a bigger window, but you want to mail that ballot in very, very quickly. We'll talk about this again. Mail it, best case scenario, if you can, 2 weeks before election day, right? That will allow for any delays at USPS to, and make sure that your ballot gets there in time. Of course, election day is November 3rd. It's the first Tuesday in November, so you can vote in person at your polling place, and we'll talk about what to do if you decide to go in person. One other thing, again, we'll talk a little bit about this with vote by mail, is what to do if you have drop boxes, where you can fill it out and drop the vote by mail or absentee ballot off rather than mailing it, and that will be another option. All right, let's go to the next slide. So how can you get a vote by mail ballot or an absentee ballot, depending on what your state refers it to? You can go online and check your state elections website. Some allow you to just apply online if you're a registered voter. Others will still require you to be a registered voter, but you can download and send a completed form in. Remember that the absentee ballot or vote by mail ballot has a lot of instructions. They'll have confidentiality or security envelopes, and you'll have to sign. Sometimes you'll have to include proof of ID. So make sure that you follow those instructions very carefully. Again, mail it in as soon as you can, 2 weeks before election day, to be super, super safe. And as I mentioned, some states do allow drop off at either your county election officials or their drop boxes. Again, return it as soon as possible to ensure that it's received in time and is counted. I know that in some states, the issue of drop boxes and how many and where they are is being contested. And of course, the more drop boxes you have, the more options you have to and access, and they're closer by where you can drop them off. So that is, again, something that you should think about if your state doesn't have those facilities, whether your vote can affect that going forward. All right, let's go to the next slide. Again, if you're going to do in-person voting, you can also do it early. Many states have early voting locations and hours that are more convenient than a weekday where you might be working. So maybe you can go in the weekend or one evening after work. But keep in mind that the locations for early voting and the hours will be different than the one on election day, and it will depend on your state and how early voting is conducted in your state. So please look at the polling place locations and hours on your elections website. Again, on election day, you can of course vote in person at your polling place. So make sure you go to the correct polling place. Don't assume it's the same one that it was for early voting. Make sure you stay in line if you get there late, as long as you get there before the last minute to close, it's fine. Even if you get there at 8 p.m. and the polling place is supposed to close at 8 p.m., stand in line, don't get out of line, and you have the right to cast a ballot. I want you to keep in mind that you should always make a plan about voting. You may want to think about how you're going to get there, whether you'll need public transportation or a ride or Uber. Make sure that in these times of COVID that you do so safely, wearing a mask, have some hand sanitizer. We have a guide of COVID best practices on our website that we are also translating in languages for what to do when you go to the polling place in these times of COVID. So we recommend that you take a look at that. And again, make sure that if you need language assistance, that you have your assister ready to go, have identified who that person might be, coordinate timings with them, make sure that everything is working. And we'll talk a little bit about who your language assister can and cannot be and what is available to you a little bit later in this presentation, but I want to make sure that you are making a plan and keeping these aspects in mind as you do it. You do have the right to language assistance. All right, let's go to the next slide. And so, as we said, a little bit later is now. So as we mentioned, language access is something that everybody has a right to. And every state has the right to bring somebody who will help you understand and read the ballot if you don't speak English very well. As long as that person is not your employer or union rep, you can bring that person in. Now, some states have restrictions as to the number of people that language assister can assist, but at a minimum, your family member can do so. Community organizations in your community can help you find somebody if you have trouble reading or writing English, but you do have the right to bring somebody of your choice as long as they are not your employer or union rep. And if there's any issues with this, please give us a call. We have a helpline. It will help us flag problems and address them very quickly. Again, make sure that you know who your translator will be if you need help. Make sure that they are available at the time that works for both of you and you both have a way of getting to the polls. So that's really important, especially these days. And then some states have more language access protections. If you have a certain population in a jurisdiction that does not speak English very well, then that jurisdiction, based on the population numbers, can get covered under what is known as Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. And if it has that coverage, all election-related materials have to be provided in the covered language. That means your ballot guides, that means your voter registration forms and instructions, online voter registration, your ballot itself, they all have to be translated into that covered language. It's a really great tool if your jurisdiction is covered, and it can really help limited English proficient voters cast a ballot. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to reiterate a little bit about what we have discussed today. Make sure you're registered to vote. It's particularly important if you want to get a vote by mail ballot or absentee ballot in this election. So do so immediately if you haven't. If you want to vote by mail or cast an absentee ballot, make sure that you request one in a timely fashion. Do it as early as possible, allowing election officials to mail you the ballot so you get it in time, and return it, complete it and return it following the instructions very carefully, again, as early as possible, especially if you're going to mail it, to allow for any delays in the postal service. Okay, if you can drop it off, if you have the ability to just drop it off at a location, I suggest you do that to be extra safe. And remember, these are all helpful tips for your friends and families as well. Again, if you're going to vote in person, make sure you vote as early as possible if early voting is available in your state. Remember, take your friend, offer them a ride, take their friend if it's possible. Make sure you go to the correct polling place. Wear a mask and take hand sanitizer, and make sure if you need language assistance that you have coordinated with the right person and they are available at the time that you want to go. You know, ask community organizations, friends, and family. They're all available to help. And again, remember, Election Day is on November 3rd. Early voting has begun in many states, so please make sure that you can vote and do so. And let's go to our next slide. I want to tell you all about our voter hotline. It's 1-888 API vote. That's 1-888-8274-8683. You can call us with any issues. We offer in-language assistance. And it's really great if you do call us if you see or hear of any problems, because it helps us address them for everybody. And so this is a really great tool, not just for you individually, but will help everybody coming in after you if we flag some systemic problems happening. Yeah. I see a message. Hold on, let me scroll down. Yes, okay, thank you, Bessie. Another resource that I want to flag for you in the next slide is our fact sheets, state specific. So a lot of these things that we talked about, there are variations state by state. So please check your state's website. And we talked about the hotline. So those are some resources that are available to help you. And then I just want to stop talking now and open it up for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll try to read them out loud and address them. I saw a question in the chat box actually about the timings for the hotlines. The hotline is open at all times. Even if there isn't somebody live, we will be checking voicemail. So definitely call at any time and leave a voicemail. We'll return your call and try to assist you. Are there any other questions? Okay, so we got a question in the Q&A saying that on social media, lots of people are saying they'll show up on election day to hold spots in line for others who may be elderly or disabled. While this is well-intentioned, is a safe and encouraged practice due to COVID. I mean, I think that they should, if this person needs assistance, I suggest that they go to the polls with the person who's going to wait in line, so they can stand in line. But you know, how will they get there? I think there's some details there that need to be worked out, but offering an elderly or disabled voter assistance is perfectly allowed and in fact protected by the Voting Rights Act, so I think that's fine. I think everybody has to make their own healthcare decisions vis-a-vis COVID, but you know, practicing safe behavior, wearing a mask, keeping social distance, I think those are good things as well. Are there any other questions related to language access that might be coming up, or have you guys encountered? Any issues with voter registration? I know, for example, in Florida, the deadline was extended because the online voter registration system crashed. I think that's just another example of what can be done if problems are reported. So we have another question. Is Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act applicable in all circumstances where language access is not available from poll workers? Yes. If you have a disability or cannot read or write English very well, you are entitled to an assister of your choice. The only exception to that is if they are your employer or they are your union representative. Okay. Another question is help for voting in the voting booth only for language assistance, or can people help if the person is uncomfortable and never voted before? I think that might be a state-by-state issue. Again, but if they need assistance in voting, that is that they have a disability of some sort or cannot read or write English very well, then they are allowed an assister in the polling booth. Is there language assistance for folks casting their ballot by mail? Well, so a few things. If you're in a state that, as I mentioned, is covered by Section 203, then that vote by mail ballot application, as well as the actual vote by mail or absentee ballot, have to be provided in the covered language. If your jurisdiction is not, then this state does not have to provide that translation. So in that instance, 208 comes into play, and you can find an assister of your choice as long as they are not your union or employer. And so at that point, your community organizations, many of whom are on this call, can help. You can also call the hotline to help you.
It looks like there are no further questions at this time. Thank you everyone for joining us. You will receive a copy of this presentation, recording, links to our election resources and hotline resources, as well as a link to the video that we shared earlier in a follow-up email after this webinar. And should you find that you have any questions after this webinar concludes, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we're happy to provide assistance. Thanks everyone.